The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
On July 14th, Sri Lanka's president resigned as his country faced economic ruin and violent civil unrest. Protesters demanded that the interim government probe allegations of corruption against the president and his family, who have dominated Sri Lankan politics for much of the past 2 decades. To discuss these and related issues, join the Democracy Forum's live debate, bringing your questions and opinions for our panel of experts. The event will broadcast live on all social media platforms of the Democracy Forum, on Wednesday 26th of October 2022, 2 to 4 p.m. UK time.
Hello and welcome wherever you are in the world to this Democracy Forum debate on a very troubled community filled with talented people living on a stunningly beautiful island that is often described as the teardrop of India or the pearl of the Indian Ocean. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your Democracy Forum host for the next 2 hours, and we're going to discuss what has happened to Sri Lanka over these decades of unrest, war, political turmoil, debt. So much upheaval and violence, from midnight massacres in villages to the storming of the presidential palace back in July. Sri Lanka is very close to my own heart because it was my first posting as a BBC foreign correspondent at the beginning of the Tamil War. And what lessons can the rest of South Asia draw from Sri Lanka's tragic story, the treatment of minorities, the reliance on a single power and its money, the monopolization by a family, and so on. To unravel this Sri Lanka conundrum, we have a superb Democracy Forum panel. Umesh, Moramudali, Neil DeVotta, Jonathan Spencer, Ali Cheema, and Deepa Ollapally. And Democracy Forum's chair, Barry Gardner, MP, has extricated himself from the turmoil of British politics to be with us to sum up our debate. And first, as always, we go to the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to give us the canvas and background of our discussions. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
I bid you a warm welcome, wherever you are, to this important and timely webinar convened by the Democracy Forum. The plight of Sri Lanka, country traumatized by its political shortcomings, exacerbated by a combined balance of payments and sovereign debt crisis, betrays many of the systemic problems which continue to beset countries throughout South Asia. I look forward with great interest to our panelists' analysis of the situation in which Sri Lanka now finds itself and what lessons may be drawn more widely for the region. I'm grateful to all of them for agreeing to participate today and for sharing their valuable insights with us. And I thank the team at the Democracy Forum for arranging this event. And I extend my gratitude on behalf of everyone who's watching the webinar to Humphrey Hawksley for again accepting the role of moderator. Sri Lanka's economic catastrophe has stemmed directly from a credit rating downgrade in 2019 and a consequent loss of access to international financial markets. These fiscally damaging events were sparked by an ill-advised budget, which introduced a series of unfunded tax cuts that had the effect of reducing state revenues by almost 1/3, doubling the deficit, and jeopardizing a $1.5 billion structural adjustment program funded by the IMF. In a further misalignment of fiscal and monetary policy, the central bank expanded the money supply by 40% between 2020 and 2022, thus stoking runaway inflation. A fixed exchange rate introduced in January 2021 became very costly to defend. The central bank spent over $2.5 billion in this futile endeavor. And by August this year, inflation soared to an unprecedented 64%, although food inflation is thought to be running at over 100%. Earlier this year, in April, the credit ratings agency Standard & Poor marked Sri Lanka's creditworthiness as SD, selective default, at the very bottom of the scale, a precipitous decline from the Beta Plus it was awarded in November 2017, 5 years ago. A combination of higher commodity prices, larger import bills, and a loss of tourism earnings as a result of COVID-induced travel restrictions all led to rising current account deficits. Between January and May this year, the currency depreciated by 70%. Foreign exchange reserves, which amounted to over $7.5 billion in 2019, were rapidly depleted. By June this year, Sri Lanka was left with reserves of less than $400 million. And on the 12th of April, the government was forced to suspend its external debt payments and appoint advisors to begin the process of debt restructuring. Future prospects are bleak. The World Bank expects Sri Lanka's real GDP to fall by over 9% this year and by a further 4.2% next year. The consequences of fiscal collapse and an unstable money supply have been harsh and unremitting, leading to an alarming upsurge in poverty. Commenting on this rapidly evolving situation earlier this month, the World Bank country director for Sri Lanka wrote, I quote, "In the face of the economic crisis, poverty estimates doubled to 25.6% between 2021 and 2022, increasing the number of people living in poverty by 2.7 million. Such dire economic circumstances inevitably have fueled a prolonged period of public unrest, protest rallies, and growing political activism, which resulted in the resignation of the entire government on the 3rd of April, and subsequently the resignation of the president, and ultimately his exodus. Undoubtedly, the economic impact has been felt widely and has had the effect of uniting civil society against the government, as exemplified in the 5-day march which occurred in February last year, following a 400-kilometer route from Potpul in eastern Sri Lanka to Polakandi in the north, involving thousands of Tamil-speaking Hindus and Muslims and delineating the furthest ends of the Tamil traditional homeland in defiance of court orders. The marchers came together in protest at the perpetuation of a political compact centered on the Rajapaksa family, which has dominated political life since 2005. They vented their anger at the concentration and misuse of executive power, lack of accountability, and the systemic evidence of political injustice. Although a new president was appointed in July, political tensions remain high. Reporting on the momentous evidence of wide-scale grassroots activism, Bhavani Fonseca, writing for the Carnegie Endowment for World Peace, reflected on the evidence of active citizenship and how it may be emulated elsewhere in the region. I quote, "Amid the bleakness engulfing Sri Lanka, the power of citizen mobilization and resistance has captured global attention and injected much-needed energy, ideas, and perspectives into the opposition," she wrote. Meanwhile, the Sri Lanka government's reckless pursuit of unsustainable foreign borrowing has propelled the country into the midst of a proxy tug of war between China and India. Although Beijing has long courted the Rajapaksa family with loans for huge infrastructure projects, such as the Matala Rajapaksa Airport, it has been slow to respond to Colombo's evolving crisis. In contrast, the Indian government earlier this year offered a package of credit, loans, and humanitarian assistance worth $3.8 billion. The outcome of this hegemonic rivalry is far from clear, but the machinations indeed reflect the shifting sands of allegiance in South Asia. Writing in the current edition of Asian Affairs magazine, Sudha Ramachandran suggests, I quote, "The battle for influence in Sri Lanka has intensified. Subsequent events have underscored to New Delhi that despite its own aid to Sri Lanka during the ongoing crisis, it is Beijing that wields the most significant clout. The Sino-Indian battle for influence is sure to heat up in the coming months." Well, welcome to the webinar and enjoy the proceedings. And please, if you have any comments or questions, put them through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. I've got to say, I found that fascinating on a completely different but similar level when you started talking about credit rating downgrade, and the impact there was exactly the same argument that we've been having here in Britain with our political turmoil.
Absolutely.
And I think it makes us understand, doesn't it, that if you don't have the strong institutions of a developed economy like we have, the actual damage and destruction that bad money can do. So thank you very much for that. Our first panelist is Umesh Moramudali from the University of Colombo, whose research includes public debt, finance, and economic development. He is actually in Colombo at the moment, so can tell us anything that's happening on the streets there. He is going to open our debate by speaking on how deep-rooted, long-term economic vulnerabilities led to the sovereign debt in Sri Lanka, and as we know, the accompanying upheaval. Umesh Moramudali, give us your argument.
Thank you, Humphrey. Thank you, Democracy Forum, for inviting me to this session. So, first of all, let's talk about what's happening in Sri Lanka right now. We are in a sovereign default, and this is happening for the first time in country's history. And we are going to restructure debt. We are in the process of finalizing an IMF program. Now, the question is why Sri Lanka ended up here, particularly in a sovereign default. Some people might say it's China, some people might say it's COVID, some people say it's Russian-Ukraine war, but the truth or the reality is that this sovereign default was caused by three long-term vulnerabilities of the economy. One is Sri Lanka's declining tax revenue. Since 1990, Sri Lanka's tax revenue has been declining so heavily, which was around 20% of the GDP in 1990 and declined to around 7.7% in 2020-2021. Now you can see that by how much the tax revenue has gone down. Secondly, Sri Lanka's exports. Sri Lanka's exports to GDP ratio was close to 40% in 2000, and by 2015-16 this came down to around 20%. So you can clearly see that export revenue as a portion of the GDP has been going down. On the other hand, usually when a country has a trade deficit like Sri Lanka, to match this, you have to have investment flow. That's how you match a current account deficit. So a country requires to have a sufficient level of foreign direct investment to match this trade deficit that a country has. In Sri Lanka's case, Sri Lanka's foreign direct investment has been very low. It's been lower than 1% of the GDP all throughout post-2000 era. So these three vulnerabilities put together, you have a very vulnerable economy. And in this vulnerable economy, what happened was, it is, let me go back a bit to 1977. Sri Lanka was the first economy in South Asia to liberalize. And after that, Sri Lankan economy constantly grew. The growth rates picked up, and Sri Lanka was a low-income country, upgraded to a middle-income country in 1997. So throughout this period, Sri Lanka received massive concessional loans, what we term as Sri Lanka was a donor darling. World Bank, US, ADB, etc., Japan, all this. And then after that, Sri Lanka's infrastructure needs were different, and the concessional financing provided to country was gradually reduced because Sri Lanka is now a middle-income country. The logic of the donors is, if you are a middle-income country, you don't require much of the financing. But as you can see, on Sri Lanka's path to becoming the middle-income country, Sri Lanka did not fix its structural weaknesses. Sri Lanka did not increase its tax revenue. Sri Lanka didn't increase the direct investment, or Sri Lanka didn't increase the export revenue either. So you can see Sri Lanka became a middle-income country actually without fixing the structural weaknesses of the economy or the institutional weaknesses or political weaknesses. So what this led to was, now Sri Lanka has much more needs, and still Sri Lanka needs a lot more borrowing. So to that end, Sri Lanka started entering the international capital markets in 2008. What in international economics, what we call, by issuing euro bonds. Sri Lanka, we call it international sovereign bonds. We started issuing international sovereign bonds or euro bonds in 2007, and then we continued to issue so. On the other hand, we also heavily borrowed from China for infrastructure projects. And what this did was, without having a sufficient export revenue, Sri Lanka's debt grew, particularly foreign debt, and tax reduced. Domestic debt also grew. So put all these things together, Sri Lanka had a very vulnerable economy. And by 2019, what Gotabaya Rajapaksa did when he became the president was actually gave tax cuts, which led to further credit rating downgrades and making it unable Sri Lanka to borrow from capital markets to repay the existing loans. So it might seem that the tax cuts were the issue, tax cuts were a significant issue, but it was the long-term vulnerabilities that existed for decades that didn't fix throughout the middle-income transition. That's what caused Sri Lanka's economic collapse. And the way out Sri Lanka needs is actually to fix these structural weaknesses, including increase in tax revenue, increase exports and investment. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to take whatever the questions.
Umesh, thank you very much for that very lucid explanation there. Could you put in a sort of wider perspective, possibly, because in the 1970s, or after independence, that Sri Lanka was sort of held up as a sort of beacon for Asia. That hasn't happened. To what extent is the detail that you gave us just now about what unfolded economically, how is that meshed into the Tamil War and the JVP and other events that have taken place over those decades?
Well, Tamil War was a problem to attract foreign direct investment and increase exports as well, because you couldn't have factories there. So that really had because some of the investors who actually wanted to come to Sri Lanka, particularly after the liberalization, they left because of the war, because the war had an impact. There were constant bomb blasters happening in Colombo, because the LTT in particular had these suicidal bombers, and the Colombo was one targeted city. So there was a bit of a reluctance in terms of attracting foreign direct investment, which otherwise would have been, because Sri Lanka was the first to liberalize. At that point, India hasn't liberalized, Bangladesh wasn't a growing economy, neither Pakistan. So Sri Lanka was a good investment destination, but the war actually became a very big obstacle at that point for investors to see Sri Lanka as a investment destination. I mean, what JVP did, JVP is one of the left-leaning groups in Sri Lanka, which had a couple of riots, one in 71 and one in 89. This also added fuel to the fire, because this was the time at which FDIs were growing. During this time, I think it was with President Ranasinghe Premadasa's era, during that particular period, there were a lot of apparel manufacturers started to come into Sri Lanka. And at that point, they sort of stopped. And there was this famous story where Motorola wanted to have a factory in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka was it's like much like Vietnam today or in the growing African country. It was a convincing and an attractive investment destination because it's low wages and the government is happy to facilitate. But the war and the other insurgencies, like the JVP riots, which actually prevented at that stage. But what I see
Sorry, I was just going to say, and is the foreign investment, are the companies now coming into Sri Lanka like they are, say, into Bangladesh in that sort of way, or are they still nervous?
They are not nervous anymore, right? You see the foreign investors are now coming into Sri Lanka, particularly after the war. We see a gradual increase of foreign direct investment. But the problem has been that most of this investment has been in what we call quote unquote non-tradable sectors, like the tourism or the buildings, apartments. You see many apartments coming up in Colombo. You see a whole port city that was a Chinese investment. So these investments, the problem with these investments is that they don't produce exports. Back in the days, you have an apparel factory. That apparel factory is not only a foreign direct investment, it will give jobs and it will give constant export revenue for you years to come. Right now, almost 50% of Sri Lanka's exports are apparel. So that comes from most of those foreign direct investments. So after that, drying up that investment, coupled with reduction of the tax rates and the government's lack of commitment to increase tax rates is what actually led to the crisis.
Thank you. Before I let you go, since you are sitting in Colombo now, Jugendra Patak asks, might Sri Lanka's experience, which you just described, herald an end to dynastic politics in South Asia? Give us a very quick yes or no on that.
I think yes, but this really depends on what level of economic difficulties people will face. Because why Sri Lankan people actually decided, or they got together to throw away Rajapakshas, was because the living conditions got so bad. There were 12 to 13-hour power cuts. There were no fuel. There were no way to go around. There were no food, medicine, etc. So that really made the people angry. So I correlate this possibility to the level of economic difficulty.
Umesh, thank you very much. Please stay with us because I'm sure we want to pick your brains some more. We are now going to Neil DeVotta, Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Wake University in North Carolina. His research interests include South Asian security, politics, ethnicity, nationalism, as well as that thorny topic of democratic transition. He's written many books on Sri Lanka and India and is currently researching links between nationalist ideologies and communal violence in South Asia. He is now going to share with us his thinking on the Sri Lankan crisis, bad governance, ethnic divisions. Neil DeVotta, tell us your conclusions so far.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the Democracy Forum for having me. Inevitably, some of my comments are going to overlap with Umesh's comments, and I suspect Jonathan's comments would overlap with both our comments. Picking up from where Umesh kind of left off, I would start by talking about some of the hardships that Sri Lanka continues to face. And just for our global audience here, the hardships right now are rather invisible because the protest movement is not as vigorous as it was a few months ago. So you have slightly better ration policies and fewer lines, and you also have the crackdown on protesters, which have kind of made the hardships people are facing rather invisible. Malnutrition continues to be on the rise. You have people skipping meals. We have children skipping school. We see children in especially rural areas and even in some parts of Colombo, fainting because they've gotten to school without a meal. We see about 100 essential medicines not being available in pharmacies and in hospitals. Inflation has doubled. Agricultural output is down by about half. The World Bank says that inflation has gone up from 13% in 2019 to 26%, but a recent survey that was done by one of the universities in Sri Lanka says that poverty now is, sorry, I didn't mean to say inflation. The World Bank says that poverty has gone up from 13% in 2019 to 26% today. But the university in Sri Lanka that did some recent work says that poverty now is at about 45%. Now, what that means is that about 9 million Sri Lankans out of a population of 22 million are facing poverty. Okay, so as Umesh mentioned, Sri Lanka was this poster child, sort of, in South Asia that gained low middle income status in 97, upper middle income status in 29, and now it's reverted to lower middle income status. And the government, is trying to use this downgrade as a way to attract concessionary loans. The economy itself has shrunk from about 89 billion in 2021 to about 75 billion today, which means that GDP per capita has come down from, say, about $4,000 to about $3,400. And so the country is facing, a dire crisis. It continues to face a dire crisis. And I think a lot of people recognize that things are going to get worse before they get better. And so what does that mean for this country, and how do you explain where it got here? What I would do is suggest that there are some proximate domestic causes for why Sri Lanka is where it is today, and there are also some proximate exogenous causes. And Umesh mentioned the tax cuts. There were about 1.5 million Sri Lankans paying taxes until Gotabaya introduced these tax cuts that were completely unsolicited. It dropped the tax base from that 1.5 million to about 412,000. To compensate for this, the government started printing trillions of rupees. This was further exacerbated when they banned chemical fertilizer in April 2021. You also have the excessive powers that were granted to the president under the 20th Amendment to the Constitution that was passed soon after Gotabaya became president, which insulated him from any sort of parliamentary oversight. And so he had these people close to him who were advising him, giving him wrong advice. And he himself was rather clueless about economics to begin with. And so all of this contributed to kind of the immediate causes that led to the crisis. When it comes to exogenous causes, you have COVID, you have the war in Ukraine, you have the interest rate hikes from the U.S. Federal Reserve and other central banks that have contributed to, that have made worse the situation in Sri Lanka. But I suggest a long-term explanation. And my long-term explanation stems from the research I've invested in over 2 decades. And so I view the world, at least view Sri Lanka in a certain fashion. And I'm not suggesting that this is the best explanation. I'm simply suggesting that this is one explanation. And it's not a very popular explanation, especially if you're dealing with people from the majority community in Sri Lanka, because it's an explanation that is rooted in ethno-nationalism. I argue that you really cannot understand what has happened in Sri Lanka unless you fully appreciate ethnocracy in the country. This ethnocentric governance that the country has been engaged in since the mid-1950s basically has gradually gotten rid of meritocracy. And it has led what we political scientists would sometimes refer to as a kakistocracy. And a kakistocracy is basically a country that is governed by some of its least competent people. And this is not in any way to suggest that Sri Lanka is full of incompetent people. Sri Lanka is full of very competent people. It's full of educated, hardworking folks. It's to suggest that governance is overseen by people who are not the most competent, who are not the most qualified, who have resorted to patronage politics, who have manipulated ethnic cleavages and religious cleavages to get where they are. And so you cannot understand what has transpired in Sri Lanka without understanding the ethno-nationalist kind of dynamics. That is also to say that you can understand the economic situation Sri Lanka is in today without understanding ethno-nationalist dynamics. So the way I frame this is by adopting a kind of longitudinal explanation that factors in ethno-nationalism. And I would suggest that we kind of look at the way in which I would embrace what we call the path dependency approach, because Sri Lanka had clear choices after it became independent in 1948. It could have built on its liberal democratic credentials. This is a country that actually had the franchise in 1931, universal franchise. Britain itself got universal franchise in 1928, I believe. So 3 years later, this crown colony was granted universal franchise. And yet within 10 years of gaining independence, it decided to embark on a path that became kind of irreversible. And this was an ethnocentric path where Sinhala only was made the national language, where slowly Tamils began to be marginalized, where subsequent policies had kept building on previous policies. Basically, these were ethnocentric policies, where politicians over time kept banking on such policies because the country's demographics are such, where 75% of the population is Sinhalese, 70% is Buddhist. They could appeal to simply the majority community to get elected. Subsequent governments came under pressure to cater to the majority and not so much the minority. You have educational policies that are instituted that privilege especially rural Sinhalese at the expense of especially the Tamils. You have a civil service that operated at a highly competent level, a civil service and also an administrative service that becomes politicized, deliberately politicized. These are not accidents that are happening. These are deliberate policies that are instituted to take care of the majority community. And in that process, as part of that process, you have people like the Rajapaksas who could continue to appeal to Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism and in the process mask the massive corruption that they simultaneously resorted to. In 2015 January, Mahinda Rajapaksa was ousted as president in a very surprising development. And corruption was a very, very big reason for his loss in 2015 January. And yet they made a comeback. It is as if people were willing to overlook the corruption that they had committed because Rajapaksa basically was very good at playing the Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist card. And it looks now that they are trying to make a comeback despite Mahinda Rajapaksa fleeing as prime minister in June, Gotabaya Rajapaksa fleeing as president in July, the other brother stepping down from the Minister of Finance as Minister of Finance in May. And so the question that you posed to Umesh as to whether this, family especially could make a comeback, I think the real answer will depend on this next parliamentary election. The election could be held as early as March or April if the current president decides to dissolve parliament, which he can do by February next year, because the constitution, including the amendment that was just passed a few days ago, the new amendment to the constitution allows the president to dissolve parliament after 2.5 years. But if parliament was to continue operating until the next election, that election would need to be held by 2025 August. And so the extent to which some of these current politicians who have been part of the Rajapaksa party and some of the Rajapaksas themselves shine in that election would tell us whether, where Sri Lanka is likely to kind of, go from this point on. But it's going to be a very, very painful process. And what we have to remember here, or the takeaways, I think, is that despite the calls that we see for change, there are these massive calls for a systems change. And I sometimes get confused as to what this systems change would look like, because there are kind of multiple voices that are making all sorts of demands. And so we don't seem to have kind of, a very coherent policy framework as to what these changes ought to be. I mean, obviously, one of the demands of the protesters was that the Rajapaksas ought to go, and that happened. But they now they seem to be kind of operating as puppeteers behind the scenes. And so I'm sorry to say that I'm rather skeptical that the kind of systems change that we need to see to revive this country, both politically and economically, is unlikely to happen. Even the economic reforms, I think, may not go the full distance, because Sri Lanka has a history of working with the IMF. I think there have been 16 agreements with the IMF prior to this one that they are negotiating now. And in all those agreements, they have promised to do things, kind of carried out some of the reforms to justify the loans, but they're not gone the full distance. And partly because of the way in which kind of, ethnocentrism is built into the country's fabric and political structure and kind of embedded within the institutions of the state, the kind of reform you're going to see will necessitate the majority community suffering enormous losses in terms of ranging from employment to all forms of other perks. And how that kind of happens is something that I cannot actually foresee. And so unless you have a revolution, and I use that word deliberately, unless you have a revolution, which could end up being rather bloody, I think this country is just going to chug along like this. I hope I'm wrong. I'll be the happiest person to be wrong. But at least that is my take as to the long-term trajectory of the country that has led it to where it is today and where it might be heading. So let me stop there, but I'll be very happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Neil, for that rather depressing, chilling account. And again, I see the parallels to what we've been going through here in Britain and also in the wider world. And I'd like to put that in perspective a bit, because we are bringing this out to the region more. You talked about the election and the Rajapaksa comeback, whereas it's quite clear about their bad governance and that how much things they've done wrong. Now, we've had a rogue prime minister here that got thrown out, and a lot of people wanted him back a few days ago. And there's the Trump issue in the States. Is this a sort of global element that's happening here, that although governments and leaders are proved to be not what they say they are or bad, there's a hankering to have them back? Sri Lanka's not unique.
No, it's not. I think populism is something that is mentioned a lot today in all of these commentaries that we kind of, read when describing the unfolding events in countries. Right-wing populism, I think, has been an issue in Britain. By the way, there was an interesting piece written in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago by Walter Russell Mead that in some ways made me think about my own work, because he said that what Britain is experiencing is just bad leadership. There's nothing wrong with the country. The country is endowed with just incredible soft power, ranging from its universities to its very talented people. And in the Sri Lankan case as well, we have this, very talented, educated, literate, people who just end up doing brilliant work when they go abroad. Look at your NHS and all the Sri Lankan doctors there. But
Yes,
things just
exactly.
don't function, in the country because of this, bad leadership. So I think, yes, we are seeing right-wing populism, but we also have left-wing populist movements. In the case of Sri Lanka and India, I think what we have is a combination of right-wing populism in the form of nationalism, and then left-wing populism in the form of kind of patronage politics. And I think that is one theme that one can latch onto when trying to draw comparisons across these countries that are very different, developed, underdeveloped, Western, non-Western. So that is, I think, one theme that one can latch onto as an explanation.
Could I ask you an impossible question? I mean, you have a number of facts. You've got the bad government, you've got the ethno-nationalism, which was the Tamil War, you've got the economy, which is badly handled, you have corruption. What percentage are each of those in Sri Lanka's going backwards? If there was no war...
But even, what I would suggest is that it's the ethno-nationalism. It's the Sinhalese Buddhist majoritarianism, because that gets linked to everything else. The war stems directly from, that the way in which that majoritarian nationalism marginalized Tamils who felt that they were better off being on their own. The corruption itself was easily legitimated or covered up by playing up the ethno-nationalist card, because what mattered was to have leaders who protected the faith, who protected the country, who protected basically the ethnic group. And as long as they were, the champions of doing so, whatever they did on the side behind the covers was kind of, easily kind of, looked over. So I would, if I had to pick the most seminal reason, pick ethno-nationalism.
James Chiriyakandath says, good to see you again, Neil. How autonomous an actor is the current president, and did the opposition SJB miss an opportunity by failing to accept a chance of government earlier this year?
Yeah, in terms of the autonomy of the president, for now at least, he seems to be kind of having no choice but do the bidding of, the Rajapaksas. But at the same time, if you look at the way the vote broke this recent amendment that was passed, the SLPP, which is the party of the Rajapaksas itself, is very clearly split, because a lot of the people ended up voting in favor of some of the things that the Ranil faction, the president's faction, wanted, as opposed to the Rajapaksa faction. So his autonomy may be kind of increasing slowly, and he still can be president till November 2024. And if he calls for a new election, it's possible that it's clearly going to, what we're clearly going to see is that the SLPP is going to suffer terribly. Some of the members of the president's party, the United National Party, and there's only one member in parliament right now, they could see quite a few of their members, win office. And so his autonomy, he's sitting in a slightly more comfortable position today than when he took over in July. And he could be in a much more comfortable position, going forward. And James's second question was...
just a very quick one from...
whether the SJB made a mistake. That is debatable. I mean, given the dire situation in the country, had it taken on the presidency, Sajid Premadasa was offered the presidency, supposedly. Could he have improved things? And so that is a kind of a debatable question. But where Ranil sits and where he stands to end up, I think, is a little bit more clearer to see.
Yeah. And a very quick one from William Crawley. Do you think that constitutional change is an answer to ethnocentrism? You were very negative before, so yes or no on that. Is it possible?
If he's referring to the amendment, no, nothing's really changed with the amendment except for a council that will provide a bit more parliamentary oversight when it comes to picking independent commissions. But a brand new constitution that incorporates pluralism and that incorporates mechanisms that allow for transparent, independent commissions that can kind of be a check on the presidency, and maybe just getting rid of the executive presidency, which a vast majority of Sri Lankans want. I think it's like 70% or higher want the executive presidency gone. So there are some positive things can be done, but very quickly, Sri Lanka has had Buddhism has given Buddhism a favored position within the country. And so I don't think that's going to go away. I think that will have to be maintained. So there are these elements that cater to the majoritarian sentiment that also would have to get kind of altered. And to what extent would even a new constitution embrace some of those things that are essential for this country to move in a pluralist direction? And my argument here would be that unless that happens, this country is never going to, kind of reach the potential that it's capable of. And we've seen that in the road it's traveled up to this point in time.
Neil, thank you very much. Much there. Stay around because we're going to come back to these issues. Keep coming back to them until we nail some of them down. We're now going to the University of Edinburgh and Jonathan Spencer, who's an expert in religion, politics, anthropology of democracy, with his specific eye on Sri Lanka, South and Southeast Asia. His current research is looking at the history of dissent in Sri Lanka and how politics unfolds among poor communities, not only in Sri Lanka, but also in India and Pakistan. He will now tell us about the roots of this crisis, particularly that vast gap between the political classes. Jonathan Spencer, your thoughts, please.
Thank you very much, Humphrey, and thank you to the Democracy Forum for setting up such an interesting conversation. Neil was right to say that some of what I've got to say is going to echo things that he said and that Umesh said earlier. But also, I think I'm hoping that it'll complement it and sometimes even deviate a little bit from it. We've heard about the economic undergirding of the current crisis, and we've heard about Neil's diagnosis of the roots in the ethno-nationalist turn in politics since the 1950s. But I want to suggest that there's a kind of structural crisis in the specifically political order, which partly overlaps with what we've been hearing about, but also partly tells a slightly different story about it. But before I do that, I want to just pick up on something that Charles Bruce said in the introduction when he was quoting Bhavani Fonseca from the Centre of Poverty Analysis, Centre for Policy Alternatives, talking about the spirit of active citizenship in the protests in April when she was writing that particular piece. And I think it's very, very important that amidst all the gloom and doom, we don't forget that there was extraordinary hope and optimism in the spirit of the protest movements earlier this year. I was lucky enough to be in Colombo for some of these moments, and the mixture of people from different social classes and different ethnic backgrounds, the non-violent nature of nearly all of the protests, although the Western media loves to call them violent, the humor that informed some of it. You had the famous shots of the swimming pool in the presidential palace being occupied by the protesters, which is one of the funniest things that many of us have seen on international news in many years. So I want to hang on to that a little bit, even while I think it's necessary to acknowledge the limitations of what's actually been achieved by the protesters. And I'll start really with a kind of paradox that Neil has already alluded to, that the protesters, they focused very much initially on the figures of the two Rajapaksa brothers and the demand for them go home was the call. Go to buy Rajapaksa and go home, which they meant go back to Los Angeles rather than go back to anywhere in Sri Lanka, and also getting rid of Mahinda Rajapaksa. But immediately behind that, they would often say, and the other 225 buggers as well. And the other 225 buggers are, of course, the existing members of parliament. So there was a general disgust with all the current political leadership from different parties, and there was a kind of anti-political ethos that informed the protests all the way through, to the extent that it was very difficult for even opposition politicians to engage with the protesters or to join in at particular points. And that, of course, is a kind of impasse, because it's great to get rid of much hated political leaders, but at some point somebody's got to sit down and talk to international bodies like the IMF. Somebody's got to come out with an alternative plan. And so behind the impasse in the protests, I think there's a bigger problem about, and again, I think this is something that Neil was talking about political leadership. Or what I would call the political class. It's an expression used by my friend Jayadeva Uyangoda quite a lot. Political elite is another term that might be used. And I want to start this by going way back to the late 1970s. In the late 1970s, the political scientist James Maynard, wrote an article about what he called the failure of political integration in Sri Lanka. And in it, he made the bold claim that the fundamental fault line in Sri Lankan polity was not the one between Sinhala and Tamil, it was the one between the political elite and the masses. And what was missing were the kinds of mechanisms by which communications could happen between the political elite and the masses, but also the people could, there would be fluidity of membership such that the political elite could reproduce itself by bringing in people from other social classes and other social situations. And what's striking about this formula, and for Maynard, things like the Sinhala-Tamil divide are kind of epiphenomenal to that. And you can see this in the late 70s, early 80s with the growth, say, of the Tamil militant movements in the north, which were explicitly repudiating the dominance of the establishment Tamil politicians of the time, of the Tamil United Liberation Front. And you can also see this dynamic playing out in the JVP rising in the south in the late 1980s, for which one of the most popular slogans was Colombo to Kitty, Appetite Kekiri. Colombo gets the milk or the cream, we get nothing, we get a little bitter cucumber or something like that. In other words, the whole system is stacked to benefit the rich and the elite. And exactly these criticisms were coming out in the protests earlier this year. But the question is then is an empirical question: to what extent the political elite has remained as sealed and remote as it seemed to be to Maynard in the 1970s. There's been very little empirical research on this since I think Tara Kumaraswamy was the last person to actually look at who made up the constitution of the parliament, and she did that work in the 1980s. But also, sorry, I've lost my thread for a second. If we look at the working through of the protest movement, what we see is this bizarre durability of the political elite, that having, as it were, spat out the prime minister and the president in these very dramatic moments in May and July, somehow the existing parliament manages to cobble together a form of government, and they manage to place as president the one man who, whatever other talents he has, is a spectacular failure as a populist leader. This is a man who actually lost his own party, and indeed didn't even get elected to parliament in the 2019 elections. So there is a crisis there, and there's a question of why have there not been new forces and new voices coming into the political class? Why has it seemed so sealed? Why do whole sections of the population? I mean, a very simple example would be women. There are 12 women MPs in the parliament out of 225. This in the country which had the first woman prime minister in the world, one of whose most important post-independence politicians, Chandrika Kumaratunga, was of course a woman. And yet there's almost no female representation in the parliament. And I think that the mechanisms that have blocked women from entering mainstream politics as representatives also block young people. They also block people from poorer communities. They block people from the regions. So there is a long-term structural crisis there, a crisis of representation. The current parliament, to go back to everybody's favorite analogy today, is indeed very like the parliament in London at the moment, where you have a large majority or a seeming majority elected on a platform which is a footnote in history now, and a leader who's also a footnote in history, but who are not going to relinquish their position in parliament voluntarily. So it's a kind of zombie parliament in a way. I hadn't realized until Neil mentioned it that there was a possibility of bringing forward parliamentary elections. It would be a very good idea if that would be the case. It seems unlikely that either Ranil Wickremesinghe or the current rather sort of third-rate assemblage of parliamentarians will voluntarily do that. But it's possible, as it's possible in the UK, that the chaotic infighting gets so bad that they absent-mindedly do it without necessarily intending it and bring forward an election. But even then, it's unclear who can stand where the spirit of the protesters, these young people who want to see a post-ethnic politics, who want to see a post-corruption politics, where they're going to find a vehicle for their aspirations. I think the good news is those aspirations are very real, and they haven't been crushed, as far as I can tell, by the repression of recent months. They're not going to go away. But the bad news is very, very hard. It's just as hard now, if not harder, to see how they can actually find an expression in the mainstream political realm. So that's my little bit for the afternoon. And yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much. I wonder if you could just ground us a bit when you talked about the political classes and what the caste system in Sri Lanka. Is that the same as is reflected in India and across the board, or does it work differently? Have they moved to improve it? What is the situation there?
It's a surprisingly complicated question. I think on the surface it seems to, and it varies regionally amongst different communities and so on. So, for example, in Jaffna, the cliche is that the caste is much more pronounced in Jaffna than in other parts of the island, which may or may not be true. By and large, caste is much less in your face than it is in India. It's not written into positive discrimination legislation. It doesn't have official recognition in the census and stuff like that. So it makes it much, much harder to kind of pin down than it is in India. You've certainly had at least one president from a lower caste group. That was Ranasinghe Premadasa. Yes. So it's not quite as closed as that. And indeed, Premadasa's, to some degree, he's the exception to what I've been saying, because he was a man who rose from a lower class as well as a lower caste family in Colombo up to urban politics. But he's almost the only figure like that to do that.
Yeah. So the blocks that you're talking about in this division between the political classes is gender that you mentioned, wealth, I suppose, and the class system, which is not a caste system.
Class and family, and class and family is the means through which class position is reproduced. And in a country where personalistic ties are so important, whether it's getting to be president or merely getting your kid into a good school, you need networks of personalistic ties. Those ties reproduce, and in the political arena, they reproduce certain families. The Rajapaksas were sometimes portrayed as kind of outsiders moving into the Colombo elite. this is a slightly dubious claim. They went to posh schools as well in Colombo. Their father was a government minister. Mahinda Rajapaksa was given his first political posting by Sidamawa Bandaranaike, who said, here you are, you can be the MP in this particular place. They're very much part of the same political elite.
Okay, so that's the elite. And is there a powerful Tamil family, or were they all wiped out in the war?
Well, post-war Tamil politics are a little bit harder to kind of work out from a distance because, of course, the LTTE shut down, the kind of constitutional parties or only allowed them to operate on the LTTE's terms, and the LTTE project was very hostile to the patrician politicians of the earlier generation, right? But since the end of the war, the patrician politicians have come back to a large extent in Jaffna too, albeit with touches of Hindu nationalism, touches of Hindutva as well. But again, that doesn't seem quite so stable. And I'm not completely sure of this, but I occasionally have a sense that there are new forces stirring up from the ground through the provincial council in the north, possibly creating new kinds of Tamil politician. I don't see similar things to that happening at all in the south.
Yeah. And a final question, which we are answering as we go through it, but if you could give your quick take on this. Philip Bowman, why is Sri Lanka so vulnerable to external shocks?
Well, I suppose it's a relatively small country, and it's made its its pitch since the late 1970s, since the liberalization of the economy, has been to sell itself to global capital, if you want to put it as crudely as that. And if global capital turns its back on Sri Lanka, it leaves it very vulnerable. And then in the years since the end of the war, it's turned to particularly the international bond market. And with various downgradings, it's gone into the bargain basement of the international bond market. And that has left it very, very vulnerable indeed.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. That's illuminated me a lot. Thank you so much. Stay around. And we are now going to look at how Pakistan could learn from Sri Lanka with Elliott Cheema, an associate professor of economics at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. And he's a senior research fellow at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives that has an acronym called IDEAS. He is in Lahore. Pakistan is also in political turmoil, frequently violent and economically challenged. Elliott Cheema, what can Pakistan learn from Sri Lanka?
So I think the big question that's being raised in the debate up till now is really, sort of what's made Sri Lanka vulnerable to external shocks or external crises. And you have a kind of similar parallel situation playing out in Pakistan. So, for me, the key thing is what Umesh started out by talking about, which is that a lot of South Asian economies continue to display structural weaknesses. And I think those structural weaknesses are being revealed in contexts where there is a global economic crisis that is going on. It started with COVID, but then sort of global commodity prices that have increased, have exposed these vulnerabilities along with the buildup of external debt. In the Sri Lankan case, because of a fall in exports and but I think I would caution against one thing, which is we shouldn't be reductive. It's not the case that all South Asian economies, or indeed Pakistan, since the question is specifically about Pakistan, was treading on a similar road to Sri Lanka in terms of its kind of economic vulnerabilities. I think that each of these South Asian countries has a different set of fragilities, which are underpinned by growth models which are fragile, which have not been designed to boost sustainable growth. And I think that's particularly manifested in the case of Pakistan's economy, which has some differences from other South Asian economies.
Are we losing Ali Cheema for the moment? Because he was about to make a fascinating point. Ali Cheema, if you can wave or come back to us, we will.
Okay.
Keep speaking then. No, you can hear us, can you? But we can't hear you. You have frozen again. I think what we will do in this case is we will. Ali, are you back with us?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Great. So what basically I was saying was that if you look at sort of Pakistan's fragilities, they are somewhat different from other South Asian economies. And the two big ones for me are the country's low domestic investment mobilization. So Pakistan's had one of the lowest rates of private domestic investment within the South Asian economies. And it's basically been export uncompetitive, which is something that it shares with.
Yeah. We seem to have lost him again. Ali, what we were going to move on to our next panelist, and could we ask you to log out and log back in again? And that's it. And we will go on to the next panelist. I wanted to ask him, and I hope we can, about the China relationship that Pakistan has with China and Sri Lanka has with China, and whether that is for the good or for the bad. But we are now going to jump from Ali to go to our final panelist, maybe not. From George Washington University, we're going across the Atlantic again. Deepa Ollapally is a research professor of international affairs specializing in Indian foreign policy, India-China relations, and Asian regional and maritime security. She is the author of many books and is currently working on big power competition for influence in the Indian Ocean region. That is a big topic. And now she is going to tell us about the regional repercussions of Sri Lanka's crisis, specifically, of course, on what it means for India, but for the Indo-Pacific generally. Deepa Ollapally, tell us what you know.
Thank you, Humphrey, and thank you very much to the Democracy Forum for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and listening to my august colleagues talk about the domestic elements. I must say that there is some overlap in some of the things that I'm going to say, but at the same time, I'll be taking a step back and looking at the broader picture. And one of the first things is, of course, that I'm speaking about this in part because of its location. Sri Lanka is a strategically located island nation. That has been a boon for it in some ways, but I think also to be seen whether the competition between India and China is going to make its location a bane. So, but let me start by coming to 3 different points that I want to make today. One is in terms of when we look at the regional impact of this crisis, it has had actually, I think, a fairly important set of impacts. And the first one is that the crisis is redefining some of the regional roles and expectations is changing the way that Sri Lanka has been holding certain expectations and who they have underestimated and perhaps overestimated. And the second point is that India's crisis management is something that has been more successful than we have seen in the past. And so I think its reputation as a regional power has gone up somewhat. And then another point is that the introduction of Japan as a major South Asian player, because it is going to lead the creditor nations negotiations, is going to be an important new element. Its partnership with India is going to be able to lead to what I see as a new opportunity for the Quad countries of the Indo-Pacific, the Quad being India, Japan, US, and Australia, and perhaps being able to give now more opportunities for providing alternatives to the China option, especially Belt and Road. That said, I think there are some caveats here that I will make, and this is related to some of the domestic, ethnocentric, ethnocratic kind of tendencies in Sri Lanka and what that means for its neighbor India. I think Neil DeVotta has laid it out quite well. I have to say I tend to be more in agreement with him on this. First, how has the crisis redefined the regional roles and expectations? I think if you look at a map of Sri Lanka, you'll see that India is really its only neighbor, and it also happens to be the only big resident power in the Indian Ocean. Now, given that, and given its preponderance, one would have expected that Indian influence would be a foregone conclusion. But India has struggled to establish its influence in Sri Lanka, especially since the Chinese presence took root there in the early 2000s. In particular, ever since the Rajapaksa family's ascendancy in 2005, who are much more China-friendly, India has really sort of almost helplessly watched as its crucial next-door neighbor slipped into China's hold. Now, obviously, at 1/4 the size of China's economy, India was no match for its rival's deep pockets. But I think an important reason is also that it was running behind in its own backyard is its lack of political imagination. Mr. Modi and team have a lot of big sloganeering, and neighborhood first policy was one of those. But it has taken a black swan event of a total collapse next door to get India an opportunity to make a historic comeback. As the crisis unfolded, you saw the Rajapaksa government literally pleading with partners, China especially, and the international community to step in. But by then, I think the Ukraine war had taken up most of the international communities, especially in the West, their attention. And so as a stunned world watched the island fall apart, China, which had been so involved, almost disappeared from the scene. And almost as unexpectedly, India showed up as what might be called the first responder, demonstrating an uncharacteristic readiness to help clean up the mess, even though it was a China-friendly Rajapaksa government that was in power. It was the first to send a humanitarian package of $16 million in food and medicine. And overall, as Lord Bruce pointed out, it's given almost $4 billion in aid, in contrast to China's $76 million. And clearly, I think Sri Lanka was overly optimistic on expectations from China. Both Rajapaksa and Wickremesinghe has found that China is a tough customer when it comes to any bailout. It's put its immediate economic and global economic interest are its priority. Sri Lanka has asked for a restructuring of its debt, but that has not been forthcoming from China. And one of the reasons is that the Chinese are exposed on this because there are more than 25 countries around the world that are in debt to China and in trouble, Pakistan being one of them. But many in Africa as well. What China doesn't want to do is to take a restructuring and especially a haircut, as they say, reducing the debt in some ways, because it doesn't want to set an example for the others. Even in as its partner is experiencing a once-in-a-lifetime meltdown. I think the whole repercussions of this will be to somewhat slow down the Belt and Road Initiative that has been speeding down for the last 5 years. The other outcome, I think, is that Sri Lanka has underestimated India. In fact, Namal Rajapaksa, the former prime minister's son and nephew of the former president, flattered India by calling it a big brother to Sri Lanka and said thanks. Now, this was a pointed break from the previous use of big brother to signify a bully. Again, they have come out publicly. The power minister was practically begging countries in July to help buy fuel. He then came out publicly to say that despite asking many countries, only India gave help. So earlier, Sri Lankan officials have been very shy to recognize India's role. It was almost seen as a pride not to be seen as relying on India. Now they're very happy to come publicly and express that. Of course, India's expectations from Sri Lanka have also gone up. It has always wanted what I would call an India-first foreign policy from Sri Lanka. And so I think there are now renewed expectations that this is what they would want Sri Lanka to change or shift its foreign policy in that direction. Now, there's some evidence that India is successful in pushing back China. For example, when a Chinese firm won a contract in January 2021 to build hybrid power plants on 3 Sri Lankan islands just 30 miles off of India's southeastern coast, New Delhi came out and objected to it, but it didn't have any impact on the government in Sri Lanka. Now, in March this year, Sri Lanka has reversed it and given India the project's development rights. So clearly, the economic crisis has opened the door for India to push back against China's growing influence in the Indian Ocean region. Again, the other point I want to make is that India's crisis management and how it has, in some sense, given the opportunity for increasing its position and somewhat its reputation. If you've noticed the kind of aid and the way in which it's the narrative that is coming out of New Delhi, it's all couched under the neighborhood first policy. Everyone, the prime minister, foreign secretary, spokesperson, always reiterate Sri Lanka's centrality in the neighborhood first policy. And it also talks about its support of democracy, stability, and economic recovery. I see this as a sort of a regional branding exercise, for its neighborhood first. A branding and that kind of is something that the Modi team really has been fairly good at in terms of, as I said earlier, sloganeering, but now actually putting some heft behind that. Also, I think the deafening silence from China for really months, in contrast to India's rapid action, also shows that Indian Ocean region, India is the only country, big power, where that is a core interest, whereas for China, it is still a secondary interest, and for every other big power as well. This is just a geopolitical reality, and it has been strongly reinforced by these events. So, I think India is motivated in large part by maintaining stability next door, but also willing to pay a price for that to edge out China. There is a lot of domestic support in India for giving aid to Sri Lanka. It's surprising. I was in India during this time period, and despite the hardships in India, most people on the ground thought that India should be helping its neighbor in its time of need. Final point is that the introduction of Japan as a major actor is something rather new. But in August this year, Wickremesinghe chose Japan to take the lead in talks on bilateral debt restructuring with creditor nations, most importantly, China and India. Japan is seen as an honest broker of sorts, no historical baggage, unlike India. It's also seen as a partner that could get additional funds with the donor conference. It has the international standing to do that. So if, as one of the Quad countries, Japan can bring India and the rest of the bilateral donors together on a restructuring plan, only China will be on the other side versus the Quad countries. So having said this, let me just make a few caveats about this redefinition and the trend here, because the domestic Sri Lankan politics is rife with suspicions about India by the Sinhala majority. There has always been something called the majority-minority complex versus the Tamil minority, who are seen as being somewhat sort of a larger group, ethnic co-ethnics across the Palk Straits with another 70 million Indian Tamils. And so I think this is something that's not going to go away. We saw some protests actually in the middle of all this when in June in Colombo over an Indian industrial Adani getting an energy project, which was said to be under pressure from Prime Minister Modi in India, that Rajapaksa was pressured into giving this. Of course, he had to come out publicly and vehemently deny it, but this just gives you an example. The other test came in August when China demanded that one of its ships be docked in Hambantota, and there was a lot of Indian pressure and American pressure on Sri Lankan government to say no. Instead, there was a delay, but it ultimately docked and for 6 days. So these are just some things to point out that it's not a smooth road by any means, and you can't take anything for granted in this situation. And a lot of that comes from some of the things that my colleagues talked about, the domestic situation in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepa Ollapally, very, very much for that. Ali Cheema is back with us, but I just want to pick up with you to consolidate your argument there, because India has over the past 30 plus years been a bit backward, I suppose, in expanding itself as a regional power. I mean, there was the Tamil retreat from Sri Lanka in the late 1980s, Rajiv Gandhi's assassination, where it didn't go and chase and hunt down the perpetrator, and as you mentioned, the Hambantota port and those sort of developments there. Is it your belief that there's been a mindset cultural change in India, that it now needs to actually be the Indian Ocean power?
I think that has been happening over the last 5 to 10 years. It's taken much longer, I think, for India, New Delhi, to come to that realization. It was caught napping in some sense, because I think what India had been doing since early 2000s is really projecting itself as a global power. And it has put an enormous amount of energy into the nuclear deal with the United States and looking west. I think it wasted enormous amount of time doing that rather than looking at the regional context. And so it's playing catch up. And it is been compelled. In many cases, India, I think, foreign policy, it moves at glacial speeds. And therefore, I think unless there is an immediate threat or a wake-up call, it moves very slowly. And I think to give some credit to the Modi government, they have been much quicker to realize that in order to project itself on the globe, it needs to take care of its immediate neighborhood much more. Otherwise, that there are others waiting in the wings, like China, to actually play that role.
And so Sri Lanka that we're discussing now, that is a test case in India's journey towards being a global power.
Yes, I think it is a test case. And I think China, what we see is that that in some sense, one could make the case that perhaps the Chinese were not, it is that Sri Lanka is not at the center of its expansionist plans, perhaps because of the way in which it was willing to just step aside for, as I said, for different reasons, for economic reasons, but it's become much more complicated for it because it has now shown that it is not the be-all and the end-all for Sri Lanka, and therefore it has shown a certain weakness, I think.
That's a very, very interesting point that could be learned by other countries all around the world. But we are now going to Lahore. Ali Cheema, are you back with us? That looks like a dark screen. Ali Cheema, I think perhaps hasn't gone back, not back with us yet. So we've got a couple of more questions in which we can take to the panel now, unless Ali can join us again. There's a couple about human rights, which I think I'll amalgamate together, and then we could go. Ali, are you with us? He's on a more important phone call. We'll leave that. Vineet, with his technological magic, will sort that out or not. A couple of questions, and we'll go backwards round the panel, beginning with Umesh. Dr. KK Updahai, in the long term, will Sri Lanka's leaders really be held accountable for economic crime, as highlighted by the UNHCR? And Rashid Ali asks about generally authoritarian regimes such as China, Russia, Myanmar, including Sri Lanka, and in the UNHCR membership, therefore vote against any move to subject countries to international scrutiny. What hope is there for Sri Lanka to improve its human rights record? Umesh, could you begin with addressing that? Just a short answer, and we'll go round.
I'm online.
Ali?
I think Vineet has done his magic.
Ali,
Hello?
Can we hear you?
Yeah, can you hear me, Humphrey?
I can, yes. If you could continue your presentation, and then we'll return to the human rights question.
Okay. I'm sorry, there seems to be some technological glitch here, but all I was saying was that the external crisis that we're witnessing in South Asian countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, in some sense, is endogenous to structural weaknesses in these countries. And I think I'd like to go back to where Umesh started. Two most important things are the inability to really increase rates of productive investment. That's a very big Pakistan challenge. And also basically, the inability to sustain high rates of productivity and exports. But I think the important point to realize there is that there is a failed growth model, which is no longer talking about technologies and innovation and investments leading growth, but trying to sort of increase growth through favorable prices or through sort of cuts in taxation. And that's something we've seen in recent events in the UK as well. So in these countries, another big challenge that's coming about is the use of the state to actually basically rig rates from exportable public investment. And it's so the growth model you have to think about for development. We need how these countries are actually create incentives for innovation activity. Key to is of investment, which are productive and innovation. And I think related to this, both in the Pakistan case and the Sri Lankan case, what is important is the political instability actually exacerbates the problem of the public sector delivering on both creating the right incentives for the economy to innovate and also for setting up public investment programs that essentially can propel growth. And I think at the heart of it is really a failure and an indictment of the neoliberal model that's dominated these economies for the past 3 to 4 decades. So I'll stop there.
Ali, thank you so much for persevering. And if you're still with us and can hear me, I think that the nub of what you're saying here gets back to this ethno-nationalism issue, the corruption and all that sort of thing. Mohammed Naveeb asks, Pakistan's economy seems to be on a similar course to Sri Lanka's. What measures can be taken to turn the tide? What measures? You can't change the culture, so how can it be fixed?
So the first thing is I think there are significant differences in the Pakistan economy and the Sri Lankan economy in terms of both the profile of debt. Basically, so Pakistan's short-term debt is very small at the moment. We have some external fragilities, but I think with recessionary contracting, Pakistan can manage this crisis. But that doesn't bode well for citizens. So if you're going to recess the economy to say, I'm going to create stability for the short term, but the expense of growth and the expense of jobs, then that is going to be a very big bill, essentially, for the Pakistani economy.
Okay. And one other question that is that in the relationship with China, because both Sri Lanka and Pakistan have got a big relationship with China that is impacting everybody living there. Can you describe the similarities and the difference?
I mean, so I think that the moment countries basically become sustainable through debt creation, then you're going to have this jockeying by international powers to influence basically these economies, or have a seat at the table, and that's just going to be an endogenous cause of it. But I think I want to go back to this issue is that you can fix these structural weaknesses for the economy to start to present it. I don't think it's a cultural problem. To implement them, that's basically the way out of this conundrum of external dependence.
Okay, thank you very much, Ali. Stay around if you can, but if we do lose you, very much appreciated your persistence there. Perhaps we'll go around the panel now, and we'll start not with the human rights question that we'll get to in this debate now. William Crawley asks, the Sri Lankan military, even when fighting radical insurgency and secessionists, has never been as politically assertive as in Pakistan. Could that change? Umesh, what is the situation there, and could it change?
I personally don't think that this could change because Sri Lankan military, as the question very correctly pointed out, it operates in an entirely different way when you compare it with the Pakistan. Only instance that Sri Lanka had a very interesting case. Actually, we had a army commander who actually ran for the post of presidency, and then we had the Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was the defense secretary, secretary to the Ministry of Defense, who ran for the presidency and became the president. So you don't see this happening while they're in the military. So I would say it's very unlikely, largely because Sri Lankan military operates in a whole different way.
That's very very interesting. Neil DeVotta, what is your view on that?
I would agree with Umesh at this stage. The Sri Lankan military is a very coddled institution. You have to remember that this military now operates less as a defense force to protect the country and more as a jobs program. Okay. And it's basically, we don't have stats on this, but I'm convinced that it's at least 97% Sinhalese. Again, coming back to this kind of majoritarianism and the way in which the state has pursued, institutional mechanisms to take care of the majority community. in the last budget that was passed, despite the challenges facing the country, the military, I think, was the only institution that did not lose any funding. This is also a military that was not demobilized. I mean, the UK military, I think, is with what, 67, 68 million people, only about 85,000 soldiers, and the Sri Lankan military is like at 250,000 soldiers, and that's not counting civil defense personnel and the like. So it's coddled, it's taken care of, it's well provided for, and as long as that happens, there is no reason for the military to kind of take on get involved in politics that would only discredit them. But that could change. Connecting to your potential question on human rights, if there's an attempt on the part of a government to go after military leaders for crimes that were allegedly committed, that changes the dynamics.
Yes. Let me repeat those two questions again, because I want to go to our other panelists on that. Dr. KK Updahai, in the long term, will Sri Lanka's leaders be held accountable for economic crimes, as highlighted by UNHCR? And Rashid Ali, with authoritarian regimes such as China, Russia, and Myanmar included in UNHCR membership, therefore likely to vote any moves to subject countries to international scrutiny. So what's the hope of Sri Lanka to improve its human rights record? And can I add to that, would it be the right way to go in order to bring improvements to Sri Lanka? Jonathan Spencer, your view on that?
On the second question, the cynical reply is that precisely because Sri Lanka is small, it's more likely to be pressured into doing something about its human rights record. And you can look at the record of the International Court of Justice and the reluctance to engage with large countries and its enthusiasm for engaging with small and relatively vulnerable ones. On the economic crimes front, again, the realist in me says that if there's any prospect of bringing the former leadership, which many people in the country would love to happen, bringing the former leadership up into some kind of court on corruption charges or something like that, they would be out of the country and in some comfortable haven before you could blink. It seems quite unlikely that that will happen. Alas, many people in the country desperately want it to happen.
But on this sort of issue of going after human rights abuses in developing countries that have erupted into this sort of thing, is it useful in order to get rid of that ethno-nationalism and the other issues we've discussed? Is it a useful way to go to prioritize that?
It's a really difficult question, actually. Because it's a question that actually the responses divide on ethno-national lines. So for particularly the Tamil diaspora, but also Tamil people in Sri Lanka itself, some international involvement in human rights is the beginning of the process of healing, they say. And for Sinhala nationalists, it's the beginning of the end. So human rights, to borrow a phrase from one of my colleagues talking about the situation in Northern Ireland, human rights becomes the continuation of the war by other means. That has what you do is a way of continuing the opposition, and that's a terrible paradox and a terrible impasse. I suspect healing, when healing comes, will probably not be through human rights mechanisms, and I suspect if there's a future which is less ethno-national, I think it's unlikely to be engineered by constitutional change. It again will come from somewhere else.
Umesh, you wanted to chip in here.
Yes, I would like to add a comment on the first one. Actually, a set of organizations, including Transparency International in Sri Lanka and some other NGOs, they have already filed a petition in the Supreme Court regarding the economic collapse, in the sense the responsibilities held by the government. Because let me remind that these were the things couldn't have been this much bad. Many people died in fuel queues without medicine, so on and so forth. We could have gone for IMF much earlier, could have restructured that much earlier. If so, a lot of lives could have been saved, right? So because of the wrong economic policies, Sri Lanka actually was put into this position. So challenging that, a petition was filed, and that was given leave to proceed by the Supreme Court. So it's difficult to comment at this point what will happen, but it's good to see that the organizations coming together and challenging this. But what history suggests is that we had a huge rahu about treasury bond scam in 2015, where Ranil Wickremesinghe himself was charged with that. There was a huge long proceeded bond commission which talked about this all for months, but nobody was brought to justice. There was no one who was punished for that, even though Arjun Mahendran, who was the former central bank governor, who was charged, who was, I think, currently in Singapore, but he wasn't punished, and many other people were not punished. So it's I'll leave it at that.
So you agree with Jonathan Spencer that going down this road could be dangerous?
Yes, going down this road could be very dangerous, and I also agree with Jonathan on the point that he made about the Tamil people, and also what kind of reconciliation the way forward for the war, that it actually has to come through other means than the constitution, because there's too much healing to be done, which cannot be done through constitution or that sort of a thing.
Deepa Ollapally, your view on this?
On the external involvement on human rights and what can be done and what's desirable, I think the case of India is actually quite interesting, because at the UN Human Rights Council just last month, on a resolution to pressure Sri Lanka, India abstained. However, it came out and made a rare public statement saying that it was concerned about Sri Lanka not making enough progress on the 13th Amendment in particular to give Tamils more autonomy. It's a tricky issue, frankly. I think generally speaking, I don't see external actors having made a great impact on democracy building. We've seen that in case after case. In Sri Lanka, I don't think it's much different, except for the short period where back in 1987, when India actually intervened and had Sri Lanka up against the wall there, when they gave in to the 13th Amendment as a mechanism to give Sri Lanka's minority more autonomy. So it really is in some sense, a question of, a power differential at any given point in time, if you can push. But I think it's not a long-term, and it's not the preferred mode because it doesn't work most of the time, even though it's desirable as a democracy. I think India, it's in a tight spot because people expect it to make a democratically aligned foreign policy in neighborhood.
But it's edging towards being more non-aligned, isn't it, at the moment, particularly with its situation in Ukraine. I'm wondering if Ali Cheema is still with us. Ali, are you here? No, I think not. Deepa Ollapally, just the China influence in Asia generally, particularly Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Could you encapsulate that for us? I mean, we know India and China are at odds, but the China influence is creeping around it, isn't it?
Yes, the short answer is yes. But when you look at China's relations with Pakistan and Sri Lanka, I think they're quite different. And I think India, there's no competition really in terms of China and Pakistan. The train has left. And but I think the rest of the Indian Ocean countries, it is intensifying the competition. And I think this crisis has made it possible to now think about alternative ways that India might actually gain or regain some of its position in the Indian Ocean states. But, the fact is that India has a certain luxury of location. That's something that's not going to go away. So even if, just to make a stark case, even if Sri Lanka were to give a military naval base to China in Sri Lanka, the fact is that it's extraordinarily vulnerable. They're sitting ducks to the Indian position there. India is kind of like an unsinkable aircraft carrier, to put it in military. So, but the thing is that, you know, short of war, there's going to be competition. In peacetime, I think India has to work really hard to compete with China. And that's hopefully, it will be peaceful for most of the time. So I think the competition is going to intensify. But as I said before, I think the Chinese cannot give equal importance to all of its far-flung interests. I think the Chinese are making a mistake by overstretching themselves. And I think that most big expansionist powers have learned that the hard way. And I think that's perhaps what is in store for China.
And what I want to do is, before we go to Barry Gardner in 1 minute, I want to go round just to give a one-word answer. We've talked about ethno-nationalism, corruption, families or nepotism or whatever. Just a one-word answer of what you think is the biggest thing holding back Sri Lanka. Umesh.
I would say the institutional weaknesses.
Say again?
Institutional weaknesses.
Okay, Neil?
Yeah, I would add to that and say, you know, it comes down basically to transparency and accountability. A lot of the corruption, the debt crisis. I would tie it. You know, you have to explain why that has been made possible, and that's when I go back to my kind of ethno-nationalist part dependency explanation. But in terms of a short answer, you know, institutions that can ensure accountability and transparency.
Okay, Jonathan?
Ensure transparency and accountability through action on the existing leadership and through opening up pathways for new kinds of political representative to emerge who could do a much better job than the current ones do.
Karen. Deepa?
I would have to say the fact that I think Sri Lanka's government has been trapped in a majoritarian minority complex. It's very difficult for it to break out of that. And that affects both domestic and international stance.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. In our final minutes, we are now going to Barry Gardner, MP, the Democracy Forum Chair, and a veteran of South Asian issues and Sri Lanka, the wider region. Barry, sum up our debate for us.
Very difficult, Humphrey, very difficult. And I'm disappointed in that I don't feel that we've answered the question that Democracy Forum posed, which was, what are the lessons for South Asia? But let me go over what I think we have done, because it's been fascinating to see the analysis that our panelists have had. Lord Bruce focused on, quite rightly, on the economy, the credit downgrade in 2019. He spoke about the result of the unfunded tax cuts. We've all had a good laugh at Trussonomics and the British situation in relation to that. The central bank intervention that couldn't halt the runaway inflation, and the government suspending debt repayments, which precipitated to some extent the crisis, but a crisis that clearly, as everybody's remarked, has been building not just for months or even years, but for decades. So he also touched on, and we'll go to that further later, the proxy tug of war over investment between China and India. Umesh Moramudali spoke of Sri Lanka's vulnerable economy. Again, focused on the economy, the debt restructuring because of COVID. Very important to realize just how badly an economy like Sri Lanka was affected by COVID, being so heavily dependent on tourism for its hard currency revenues. But he also highlighted the role of China, the lower exports that came about during COVID. China is actually, I think, only the fourth largest creditor to Sri Lanka. The 36% of credit to Sri Lanka is from Western private sector bondholders. You've then got the Asian Development Bank. You've then got Japan. China comes in somewhere between 10 and 20%. But he highlighted not just tax cuts, but long-term structural weaknesses in the economy, and was the first to point out that India has been a lot quicker than China to provide aid, offering, I think, 4 billion as well as food, fuel, and medicines. So India's intervention has been unexpected, but really quite remarkably swift in response to the Aragalia, the struggle that went on. Neil DeVotta took us fundamentally back to that history of ethnocentric nationality. He interestingly talked about the calmness of the protest movement. And when you remember that that's against a background of malnutrition and the lack of medicines, the huge human problems that families are facing, it is quite remarkable that the invasion of the palace and so on was carried on with such good humor, as he pointed out when he spoke about the swimming pool. But poverty, absolutely, 45% increase in poverty, 9 of the 22 million people facing poverty, I think is a figure that he quoted, and spoke of the GDP per person declining from around $4,000 to around $3,000 dollars rather per annum. And he also talked about the unprecedented presidential power that Gotabaya had got in place, and how ethnocentric government had replaced meritocracy, absolutely fundamental. And of course, that's not just recent. It goes back right through to the 1950s, when you had the exclusion of the Tamil language, when you had the exclusion of Tamils from the university, who had previously, that group who had previously provided so much of the civil service of the country. But I thought it was good that he focused that the talent is there. It's always been there, he said, since the universal franchise in 1931. But remarked that you have 70% of the country that is basically Sinhalese, Buddhist, and it is possible with that sort of distinction between a majority and a minority to make sure that you govern only in the favor of the majority. He was very clear in his blame of the Rajapaksa family, but I do think we also need to think about the way in which Western debt has fueled a sort of process of colonization for 450 years, with that 40 years of neoliberalism on top. And then the 4 years of homegrown political madness. The country imports too much, it exports too little, and it tries to cover the difference with debt, and that is simply not sustainable. Jonathan Spencer talked about the spirit of active citizenship and the hope that he saw in the protests, again emphasized how they'd been nonviolent. First focused on the "Gotta Go Home" slogan, but projected that out to the entire political elite. I sometimes wonder whether there's another lesson for the UK in that, or a parallel for the UK in that the disturbances may be in one party and the quick turnover of politicians in one party, but I think the whole political elite gets tarred with the brush. And he quite rightly said, look, it's a hugely difficult impasse. Who is going to govern this country? The failure of political engagement in Sri Lanka, he alluded to that paper by Jim Maynor. And he asked, has the political elite changed? Why has no new parliament emerged post the ethnocentric, post the corruption? And of course, Vikram Singh has unleashed the military on demonstrators, arrested trade unionists. I was surprised that I think it was not until Jonathan Spencer mentioned corruption at this point that it had actually been raised in the panel. And then, of course, subsequently, much of the discussion was around the issue of corruption and the way in which the UNHCR had raised that question and could be seen to deal with it. But Sri Lanka, as a colony with governance effectively outsourced to the IMF, exporting cheap labor, exporting resources, and importing those finished goods that were so expensive. Again, this whole sense in which the economy is just completely the wrong way round. And of course, the IMF has actually extended its loans to Sri Lanka by 16 times. So if you look at where we went, I'm sorry that we didn't get more of Ali Cheema, and what we got because of the technological problems was garbled, not because what he was saying was garbled, but just because we couldn't hear much of it and it came in bursts. But talking about low domestic investment, thought that was very important. We need, if Sri Lanka is going to be able to be turned around, there has to be domestic investment in the infrastructure that is trying to channel more money down to the bottom of society, where actually it will get spent not on the Rajapaksa family's luxury foreign villas and savings in foreign denominations, but actually reinvested in the country, spent within the country. He spoke of the inability to increase that rate of investment and the failed growth model. I really would have liked to have heard more from him on that, because I think that's very important. Dr. Deepa Ollapally, well, she took the estate agent mantra, location, location, location. But she talked about the redefinition of the expected roles of the regional players. Again, focusing on how India had managed well. Very important to recognize what she said about the leadership Japan has taken in terms of the negotiations on the debt and the role that it can play as a sort of credible, honest broker in the region, but also that sense that the Quad has an influence here. And China may be backing off in the way that it did from lending a helping hand during the turmoil, and India coming forward to do so may be seen in that context. And I think strategically is important, that neighborhood first policy that she spoke of actually beginning to bear fruit. So what does a useful rescue package look like? Well, first of all, let's get fuel and fertilizer to farmers to begin production for a healthy harvest next year. If we're looking at lessons for the region, 60% of low income, 30% of middle income countries have debt distress. Pakistan, Bangladesh, real problems in terms of its borrowing and their ability to repay. And of course, the whole principle of sound money about borrowing to invest, not to consume, is absolutely essential here. Again, that understanding of how we can have domestic investment in infrastructure that is going to actually level up the economy, put funds into the hands of the people who at the moment are going to use it to drive the economy forward in real growth. 60% of the world's workforce has lower real income today than it did before the pandemic. We have to address that problem. And I think one of the lessons, not only for Sri Lanka, but for the region, is that we have to ensure that that investment goes in the right way to raise that standard of living, which people are beginning to feel is driving them towards, and I think the word was used, revolution, rather than this gradual process of amelioration of the financial situation. So at the end, you asked what were the things that were holding Sri Lanka back, talked of those institutional weaknesses, talked about transparency, failure. I think transparency, again, absolutely critical here. But a fascinating discussion. I'm not sure that we've taken out the lessons for South Asia in quite the way that the original question was posed, but we certainly had a very good chew over the analysis of what's happened within Sri Lanka itself.
Barry, thank you. But could you give us your mind, and in a couple of seconds, what are the lessons for South Asia?
I think corruption has to be tackled. That means you have to have transparency within the polity. That means it has to be a condition of trade and trade alliances and free trade agreements. There has to be just trading, a just trading structure in which these things like International Labour Organization rights are incorporated in trade agreements. IMF loans have to be conditional on transparent financial structures within the country and a real clampdown on corruption. So there are structural things that can be done that would stop the sort of collapse of an economy and a polity that we have seen in Sri Lanka. Whether they will be or not, I don't know. But there are countries in South Asia that would certainly benefit from that sort of rigor, that sort of transparency, and that sort of respect for human rights.
Barry, thank you very much. We'll let you go back to fixing the mess of trustonomics now. Whilst you were speaking, a couple of the panelists went in. Umesh says that the biggest lender, international capital markets, Eurobonds, 36%. China is the second largest creditor with 20%. And Deepa said, this is interesting, in terms of Chinese v. Japan and India credit different too. China's interest rates average around 3.3% against 7% for Japan. And China's maturity period tends to be shorter at 18 years, these 34 and 24 for Japan and India loans. That's it. Time's winged chariot is upon us. Read our sister magazine, Asian Affairs, where we dig deeper into regional issues, looking at angles that many publications overlook. It is incredible journalism. Next month, on Tuesday, November the 15th, our Democracy Forum debate takes us to Iran. Will civil unrest change the face of Iran? That's an issue so central to the balance of global power and world peace. Thank you, our audience, for your thoughts and questions. Thank you, our superb panel, Umesh Moramudali, Neil DeVotta, Jonathan Spencer, Ali Cheema, if you're still hearing us somewhere, and Deepa Ollapally. Thank you, Barry Gardner, for finding out the lessons for South Asia, and Lord Charles Bruce for giving us the canvas on which our debate took place, and all the team at Democracy Forum. Until November the 15th and Iran, stay involved, keep questioning, and stay safe. Bye.